Okay, so many people ask when I study ancient Near Eastern history, and they study it themselves. One of the biggest questions they always say, "Well, wait a minute, is God copying what the nations are doing? What's the difference then between the Bible and the nations? Is everything so similar?" There are certain laws for the Hammurabi Code that are exactly the same way as in the Torah. So is Moses copying from the Hammurabi Code, or is he making a contrast between the righteousness and the justice of God versus the kings of its time when he wrote the Bible? So when you look at ancient history, please understand that the difference is the contrast. What are the values? God's worldview versus the worldview and the surrounding areas in which Israel found themselves in. That's one way you can really understand it. So to make the point, let me go to something that I mentioned already in my Torah portion, but I want to take you to a little comment that I saw here in the Sundervan Bible Illustrated. This comes from the Sundervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary by John Walton. And this really encapsulates exactly what the contrast is. When Israel's going to the land of Israel, you have to think about where they're coming from Egypt, what they're encountering in the wilderness, and where they are going into the promised land. They have different cultures, although there are similarities among all of them. Different customs, different rituals, although they all worship the same thing, but with different names and different rituals and different myth in each area you went to. Now, the duty of Israel was to establish a value system to represent God as the image of God on the earth, to live different, speak different, worship differently. So when you begin to study ancient Near Eastern history and something seems to be exactly the same, the question is, what is the righteousness of God and the message he's trying to bring compared to, in contrast to, the way they lived in the ancient world? Example, the Hammurabi Code. In the Hammurabi Code, there are certain laws, and this is an argument that I heard myself at a yeshiva in Jerusalem in 2004. When I was listening to a midrash of the yeshiva, the argument was, well, wait a minute, you have this particular law when a bull gores a person, and then when you read the Hammurabi Code, you have exact same law. And then they were trying to wonder how did it apply. Well, when you begin to really study ancient Near Eastern history, in contrast to the Bible, you recognize that the justice system of the ancients was based on a caste system. It was based on a caste system, meaning that if you belong to the social status of honor and wealth, they treated you differently than if you were a slave or a common man. A citizen had certain rights, but a slave did not. Well, let me give you the example of this in today's world. Hunter Biden can get away with everything because he has the name of the President of the United States and they're covering up for him. Versus the son of Trump, who cannot get away with anything because he was perceived as being a shameful person. So although they're both in the same status, but because of the worldview of one versus the other, one is attacked and the other one is not. In the Hammurabi Code, as well as in Egypt and other places, it was based on a caste system. The Torah shows equity for everyone. So the value of God is, regardless of who you are in your status, if you have money and if you don't have any money, you're all citizens of the kingdom. So if you break the law, idolatry, either one dies. If you commit adultery, regardless of your status, you will die because you're transgressing against God. That's one of the main views of our perception of the Bible. So if they're going to go into the Canaanite kingdom, or in this case, the land of Canaan, what was their worldview? What is Israel being told not to do? And what is the worldview and the values of God coming into the land of Israel that used to be the land of Canaan? The Canaanite worldview included cult of the dead, the worship of many gods, especially El, the god, the Most High, Baal, female goddesses abounded, Anat and Asherah, many high places, sacred prostitutes, and possibly their human sacrifices. So now when you read the book of Deuteronomy, keep in mind that God is telling Moses, renew the covenant and let me give them this 200 commandments that would allow them to be distinct, to be different, that when they see Israel, they are imitating their God and not imitating the worldview of the land that they're going into. And when you look into the first century, it's the exact same thing. Have you ever studied Greco-Roman caste system? Yeshua was fighting against the caste system introduced by the Hellenization of Israel and also the Greco-Roman world. And Yeshua is trying to bring them back to the righteousness of God and the equity that God always wanted Israel to live by, to make a distinction, to be truly the essence of the image of God on the earth, of a kingdom that shows no favoritism to anybody. And you see that in the wilderness when everybody had the same amount of manna. Moses and Aaron, the highest office in the land, they had the same exact amount of manna like anybody else, and they had to go and get it like anybody else. God shows equity, not equality, because no one can be as equal in rank and in role as the high priest. But they all had equity that if Aaron will commit idolatry and adultery, he will equally die as if the children of Israel did that. That's the difference between the book of the Torah and the treatise versus ancient Near Eastern history. The righteousness and justice of God versus the so-called righteousness and justice of the nations and their kings. Shalom.